We all know this lady, the Queen of Hearts. She's been immortalized in songs. Lewis Carroll made her Alice's nemesis in Wonderland. She's been responsible for winning fortunes and losing fortunes. And like any woman with time spent around lots of money, she's had the opportunity to have plenty of makeovers over the years. Because although she looks like this now, there was a time when she looked a lot more like this. The Queen of Cups. Some of you may know this as a tarot card, part of the Rider-Waite tarot deck. Yeah, they're the same thing. This is a stylized version of this. And the four suits of this deck, clubs, diamonds, spades, and hearts, have analogs and were originally in this deck as wands, pentacles, swords, and cups. Why is that important to this whole thing? Well, it's a part of the human social cycle. And it's weird that in a tradition that has lasted so long in the West, and how long has it lasted? These things, tarot cards, they hit Europe, as far as we know, in the 13th century, right? The 1200s. And where did they come from? Well, as far as we know, they came from Egypt. And while now these guys are used as divination, fortune telling, and these guys are used mainly for gambling and card tricks, when they first came in, they were used for both. And there's been many different types of decks, but they all have four suits, and the suits are all meant to represent the classes of people that they saw around at the time. Now, what are those suits and what are those classes? So let's start with wands, which is also clubs. Well, this is the weapon of the common man, right? When the mob gets up in arms, it's blunt objects, right? When there's riots on the streets, what are they doing? They're grabbing and they're breaking windows and they're kicking and they're punching. The idea of like pitchforks, right? Easy implements, clubs. And then diamonds, which in this, the tarot deck, is called pentacles. But what it is it's a coin with the five-sided star on it. Initially, it was coins. So, diamonds, coins, they are a representation of stores of value, of money, the weapon of the merchant. And then spades. Well, we look at the spade and we have garden spades, right? But spade is an anglicized version of the Spanish or Latin, Italian as well, espada, which means sword. And sure enough, tarot deck, swords. That's one of the suits, which is, of course, the weapon of the warriors. And then, last but not least, hearts. Now, the heart in this deck is a stylized version of a cup or chalice. And it really makes sense when you think the red heart which pumps blood, and the chalice in the church which holds the blood of Christ. And then you see whose weapon it is. It's the weapon of the church. And of course, for our varnas, it's shudra as clubs, swords, spades, kshatriya, vipra, that's going to be cups and hearts, and vaishya, that's going to be diamonds, coins, pentacles. And even in the major arcana, what they call, we've still got this little guy running around Vegas. Boop! The Joker. And the Fool. Now, why is this interesting? Well, first off, it's interesting because what we're seeing is a reflection of 4 varnas, 4 classes of people coming into Europe. This concept coming into Europe from Egypt, we can assume that it didn't start in Egypt in the 13th or 14th century. It was likely there much earlier. But when you see concepts like this and ideas, and you know that there is a background, the first time that these varnas are mentioned in the Indian Rig Veda text is, they don't know exactly how old it is, but there are estimations that it's either 1700, maybe at the long shot. Sort of the one that's most accepted is they'll say 1500 BC. 1500 BC. When you see these types of concepts arise in 2 places that, as far as anyone can tell, didn't have contact, you have to either assume, 1, we're missing a point of contact, right? That they had a single source and then it disseminated out. The concept disseminated out. Or the other thing that can happen with concepts is, if they are self-evident, 2 cultures with no contact can both figure it out. So there are concepts out there, ideas like spears, bows and arrows. These are things that came up in different places around the globe. Ideas like money, ideas like human sacrifice. It's hard to pin them down, but in this case, what we have is the Rig Veda mentioning it. And then we've got these tarot cards showing up. We've got some evidence that down in Egypt, here's the same concept. How can we trace it back? Is there something further back in Egypt, coming out of Egypt, that's written down that would say that maybe this concept had been there? Now, this is where we come full circle from the revelation that I talked about in episode 5. Remember, in the Torah, in the Old Testament, in the story of the Garden of Eden, the serpent tells the truth. That the serpent in the Garden of Eden told the truth to Eve and then was punished for telling the truth. That was a revelation to me because it made me look and see if maybe there wasn't something else going on in that text. Something else. Now, from episode 6 to now, the talk of the human social cycle, the varnas, P.R. Sarkar's work, the examples that I've given throughout history, these were all things I already knew when I had that revelation. But as I started to look at the text in a whole new light, as I started to look at that first book of Genesis written by Moses, something popped out at me that blew me away. I'm getting goosebumps even thinking about it right now. Now, you'll remember in a previous video me explaining that you can only truly understand an individual and their actions when you look at them in the context of the world in which they live. So when we look at Moses writing his 5 books of Moses, particularly when we look at Moses writing Genesis, first we have to say, who was Moses and what was the world that he lived in? Well, the legendary story of Moses is that he was a Hebrew who his mother saved him from a purge by sticking him in a little reed boat and floating him down the river, where he was found by a member of the Pharaoh of Egypt's court. And he was raised as an Egyptian. As a matter of fact, he was raised as a son of the Pharaoh. This is the legend. And you may not know this. It was actually a surprise to me. And even I didn't know this, but since doing these videos, I've found out this information. Sigmund Freud, the father of modern psychology, the last work that he worked on, the last book, it's really a series of essays. The last thing that he worked on, in fact, published the same year as he died, 1939, when he was 80, it's called Moses and Monotheism. And it is him making the attempt to prove, and I think doing it successfully, that Moses was an Egyptian priest of a monotheistic Egyptian religion that we know was started by Pharaoh Akhenaten around the time of Moses' life. He's said to have been born around 1400 BC. And that he was escaping the persecution of this new church and this new religion, this monotheistic religion, that when Akhenaten died or was killed, the old priests came and reverted the society back to the pantheism. So, one thing that we know, that every source says, is Moses was an Egyptian. The Exodus is an exodus from Egypt. And the second thing we know is that Moses was a priest. He had been trained, he had deep training in spiritual and religious matters. The spiritual and religious matters that he would have had training in were Egyptian spiritual and religious matters. So his spiritual background was Egyptian. Moses was an Egyptian the way that Jesus was a Jew. And Muhammad himself said that he was simply a follower of the God of Abraham, the same as Moses and the same as Jesus. So in some ways, I guess you could say Muhammad was making a claim, in a way, to be a Jew as well. People who start new religions or who write, rarely are they claiming that this is a new religion. At least not the ones that stick. What they are doing is they are trying to elucidate and better explain the religion that they come from. Martin Luther was a Catholic monk. Martin Luther's contribution and his writing was to say that the Catholic Church was not following the true doctrine of Christianity. That became Protestantism. He was actually trying to make a change in the Catholic Church. He wasn't trying to break away. He was trying to better explain where they had gone wrong, so to speak. So, Moses is an Egyptian priest. He is carrying with him, and by the way, you can find a PDF of Freud's work, Moses and Monotheism. It isn't that long, The English translation is actually not like very scholarly at all. It's translated very, very well. It's relatively short and it's pretty awesome. I'd suggest reading it. I just summarized what he said here, but this is Sigmund Freud we're talking about. This is one of the great minds. And it's the last thing he worked on. It was the final thing he had come to, and what he thought would be the most controversial. Moses, the Egyptian priest. Let's walk through Genesis and see what blew me away. Now, the Jewish, Judaic, Christian, and Islamic theology. Within that, they all say that the God that they worship, the God that is the God of Western society, that is the God of the three great Western religions, is the God of Abraham. The God of Abraham. Abraham first makes his appearance in Genesis. He's one of the patriarchs. It's interesting that they would say the God of Abraham, though, because Abraham is a descendant. And we get the lines of descent. It's actually laid out very, very well in terms of names, kingless, as it were, throughout the book. But there are, before Abraham, 3 other male figures that the story up to Abraham stops and dwells on. That the story stops and tells their story. Because there are dozens of others where it just says, he begat, he was the father, and then he was the son. And this son, he lived 300 years, and then he had this son. And then he lived 300 years, and he had this son. There's plenty of that. But, like I say, there's 3 other stories before where we stop. In order, those are Adam, the first man; Cain, the son of Adam; Noah, who is a descendant of another son of Adam, Seth. As the book says, he's a descendant of Seth. And then a descendant of Noah, quite a ways down the line, you have Abraham. So let's walk through the story and see the characteristics of these 4 men and see if it doesn't shed some light onto why this would have blown me away. So, Adam is created. He's created by Yahweh Elohim, the Lord God. He's placed in a garden that we are meant to see as essentially paradise. And he's told that he can eat off any of the trees in the garden. If we were to look at this in a sort of literal historical sense, Adam is a gatherer. He's a primitive gatherer. He didn't plant, he didn't sow these things. God just set everything up. And God said, it's for you, except for one tree, of course. It's for you, go ahead. All right, so if we're looking at history and we're looking in the human social cycle, Adam would be a Shudra, an indigenous person. And Adam, like the Shudras, evolves, doesn't he? He gains some wisdom. And with that wisdom, what is the thing that when he's kicked out of the garden that now he does? Agriculture. That's actually his punishment. Agriculture. Now he has to till the soil. He becomes a farmer. So now we have a little more advanced indigenous societies that farm. Well, we know this follows history. It also follows the human social cycle. Now, he has a son. If we're looking at this in metaphorical terms, because we're dealing with metaphor here, he has a son. In fact, he has two, Cain and Abel. And Cain is a farmer. He farms. And Abel is a shepherd. So we've just introduced a new technology, which, yes, that's exactly what followed next. Animal husbandry. And what happens between the two of them? Cain rises up against his brother and kills him. Violently kills him. The reason is, if you go back through the text, that it was an attempt to control him. Abel wouldn't be controlled, so Cain kills him. And when now Yahweh, different character, not Yahweh Elohim, but Yahweh, Lord, the Lord, sees that he's done this, he kicks him from off the farm. And Cain is worried, and Cain says, well, since I've done this, now is everybody going to try to kill me? Since I'm a murderer, right? Isn't everybody now going to try to murder me? And Yahweh says, no, I'm going to give you a mark. So that if anyone should kill you, you will be avenged 7 times. Now, I don't know how you kill somebody 7 times, but I'm assuming that maybe you kill their family. But either way, it's to say, you, as you wander through the world, will be able to have a monopoly on the use of violent force. You'll be able to use violent force against others, and they will not be justified in using it against you. Well, that's the kingship. That's the kshatriya. That's the warrior rise to power. And if there was any question about if it is a kshatriya, what's the first thing that he does? He builds a city and he names it after his son Enoch. Kshatriya. He builds a kingdom. And then we get a long list of his children. And the very last one, Lamech, at the end of that chapter, even says, like, I killed a man, I killed a boy. Just for insulting me, just for wounding me. And if Cain should be avenged 7-fold, I should be avenged 77-fold. This is in the story. Kshatriya. Okay, so then you're like, all right. Maybe I'm just making this shit up. Maybe I'm just imagining this. So let's go to the next one. It would have to be what? The thinker, Vipra. And who's next? Noah. And what is the functional story of Noah? It's important. It's important, especially in light of the context that Moses, the priest, is a Vipra. Noah gets advanced warning from God that a flood is coming. And because he gets that advanced warning, he's able to do some building and construction. Building and construction. He's an architect. He's an engineer. He's a thinker. He's able to do some building and construction in order to build a ship and save his family and all of their livestock when this flood happens. Why would the knowledge of a flood mean something to Moses? That this would be the power that he gives to Noah. Moses is an Egyptian priest. The main function of Egyptian priests, well, you have to understand Egypt. And you have to understand how the civilization of Egypt evolved into such a power. It really is in the middle of the desert, but it hugs the shoreline of the River Nile. And every year, like clockwork, the Nile floods. Basically, the rains in the highlands of Ethiopia, where the source of the Nile, Lake Tana, is located, the rains out of that rich highland soil put it all in Lake Tana, which overflows its banks and sends it down the Nile. And the Nile overflows its banks, and this rich silt replenishes the soil on the banks. And as it recedes, that soil becomes wonderful farmland. And the priests of Egypt predict their job, their main job, and how they came to power was being able to predict when these floods would happen. In fact, the calendar of ancient Egypt was made up of 3 seasons divided into 4 months, as opposed to different than ours, we have 4 seasons divided into 3 months each. The very first season and the very first beginning, their New Year's Day, began the season of the flood. And it was marked by the rise of the star Sirius. When they saw the star Sirius rise, then they knew the season of the flood has begun. The floods will be here within days. The ability to predict a flood and to benefit from it. Now, Moses was an Egyptian priest around 1400 BC. But the first dynasty, the first pharaoh of Egypt, where we say ancient Egypt began, 3100 BC. So by the time of Moses, there's been an unbroken lineage of pharaohs and priests for 1700 years. That's like there had been an unbroken civilization and an unbroken religion and kingship and government from the birth of Jesus to the birth of George Washington. Could you imagine? Could you imagine how much knowledge? Then is it a wonder that you would have wonders like the pyramids of Egypt? But 3100, how long had they been timing this flood? How long had they been observing these cycles? How long had there been a Vipra priesthood in that region? Well, in the desert of Nubia, south of the ancient kingdom of Egypt, where we know that the Egyptians came from. They came from Nubia. They came from the south to the north. In that desert, there is a place called Nabta Playa. And in Nabta Playa, there are stone circles, much like Stonehenge, calendar stones, that have been dated now to 6100 BC. And they know it's 6100 BC because it lines up with the rising of Sirius. The stones line up with the way the stars are when Sirius was rising in 6100 BC, right in that range, 6088 actually. So that's to say that 3,000 years before the first pharaoh even, there were priests predicting the flood. That the first action of a priest in ancient Egyptian culture and ancient Egyptian understanding of their world, the first action of the first priest was to predict the flood. The first action of the first vipra was to predict the flood. What is Noah's action? To predict the flood. So Adam, the Shudra, Cain, the Kshatriya, Noah, the Vipra. And then, the next up where they stop is Abraham. And what is Abraham's first move? We get some information about him wandering around, and then there's a famine. There's not enough resources. Wait a minute. There's not enough resources. And he heads down into Egypt. And for lack of better terms, he pimps his wife to the Pharaoh. He tells her, this is the first thing Abraham does. He tells her, listen, if we go down there and you say that you are my wife, that we're married, they'll kill me and probably kidnap you. But it'll be all good if we go down there and we say we're brother and sister. And so they do. The psychology of branding. He makes a merchant move. He makes a story about this situation that changes the perspective of value. Because when you change value perspective, profit. And then we hear that, I guess this doesn't sound right, but it's the story that's being told, that when the Pharaoh finds out that they really are married, that he's like, get the hell out of here. But they leave with a whole bunch of goods and riches. He leaves a rich man. He goes into a city, does a financial transaction, pimps his wife, prostitution, the oldest profession, and he's her manager, straight up Vaishya. And they leave with money. And that is at the place that God becomes a purely psychological creation, which is why they say the God of Abraham. But we stop on 4 people, and we stop in the exact order that we've just discussed. Adam, Shudra, to Cain, Kshatriya, to Noah, Vipra, to Abraham, Vaishya. And it's not like I just picked 4 out of like 10. There's just 4. Coming out of Egypt, exactly where the tarot came from. So, for how long have people seen that this cycle existed? For how long? How old is it that it has been lost to us? And yet it's been in front of our eyes this whole time. It's been in our Bible, in our playing cards. It's been in history. If we understand it, it's been seen by Marx. At least one change. It's been seen by so many others without the full breadth of history. But now we have the history in our pocket. I couldn't have even done the research to talk about this project. The research that has taken me a year would have taken me a lifetime, even 20 years ago. But now it's right in your pocket. Everything that I've said, you can look it up right now. You can Google it right now to verify that what I've said is the truth. So it's there. It's not made up. It's not a figment of imagination. It's been repeated over and over and over again. And here we sit with this knowledge on the cusp of a major change. Because even in that Old Testament, even in that Genesis story, what we see is that Shudra is a start and Vaishya is a sort of endpoint. And although it's a cycle, that the move back to Shudra from Vaishya is significant, a return to the garden, if you will. A return to the garden. And the crazy thing about it is, the solution or the competitive advantage that those who are going to take advantage of the shift from Vaishya to Shudra in these coming years, exactly what they will be doing that will give them that benefit is they will be actively returning to the garden. Literally. That's what I'm going to cover in the coming videos. If you'd like to discuss this, I'd love to. For me, it's finally that I've been able to get all of this together. And I can't wait for you to hear the actions that I'm taking myself. And I would love to talk about them. I'd love to talk about this entire series so far or just this episode. You can do that at facebook.com/VinArmani. And I'm looking forward to hearing from you.